In this video, I'm going to talk about forms of immersive media, in particular the forms virtual reality, 360-degree video, and augmented reality. I'm going to talk about some of the definitions of those three forms and the differences between them. I'm going to talk about some of the key concepts involved, particularly immersion and presence, and also the academic concept of remediation and how we can use that to inform some of our work. And finally, I'll focus quite a lot on some of the editorial choices to consider when either deciding whether to use VR and AR and 360, or indeed, if you're going to make one of those forms, how to make sure that you're covering all the different elements to consider in those types of stories. Now, these slides have lots and lots of video involved, so it's well worth getting the slides set up so you can spend some time watching the examples that I'm going to touch on. I'll play a little bit of these in the slides, but mostly it's over to you to have a little bit of a play and particularly use any 3D, virtual reality goggles that you might have yourself. First of all, let's talk about some of the distinctions involved. The virtual element of virtual reality can often have one of two different interpretations. Some people will talk about virtual reality as only referring to those videos where the environment being filmed does not exist. So in other words, the reality has been created inside a computer. It is entirely virtual. We'll see one example in a minute. Alternatively, the idea of virtual might refer to the idea of an environment that is not in the same time and place as the viewer. So, for example, if I'm watching a virtual reality video about Wembley Stadium, that reality does exist, but I'm virtually being placed in that reality. And those terms are often used in different ways by different people. Now, 360-degree video, on the other hand, is definitely real. It's a video that has been filmed in a particular environment in 360 degrees, with the difference being that the viewer is not physically present in that environment at the same place and time. Now, of course, there might be situations where they are physically present in the same environment and watching a 360-degree video of that environment, but in a different time. This is very similar, in fact, to augmented reality. In augmented reality, you are in the same space, but you're seeing some extra information as you look around yourself or as you look around the environment that augments what you see in some way. Typically, that extra information, that extra layer, is data-driven, but not always. So let's start with one example. This is an example of, if you like, truly virtual reality. This is a VR video about Alzheimer's disease, and you can see that, peek inside the... I'll just pause that so the audio doesn't overlay me. You can see that this environment has been created digitally. Of course, the brain is a real environment, but this particular brain is not real. This is virtual reality. And I'll just play a little bit of this.
Brain, you'd see remarkable cellular circuitry. Billions of nerve cells called neurons are linked together by bushy branches, sending signals to generate thoughts, memories, movements, and emotions. Alzheimer's disease slowly destroys those...
Now I'll just pause it there. As you can see, I'm showing you this in 2D. You're not experiencing this as a 360-degree video or a piece of virtual reality. So it is worth, if you do have any sort of virtual reality goggles, spending a bit of time experiencing this. A couple of things to draw attention to here. When you are watching video in 2D, 360 video or virtual reality video in 2D, you can click and drag around that environment instead. We've got the environment, but also some labels attached here. And we've got the narration as well to direct your attention. And I'll talk about some of those different editorial decisions later. First of all, though, there should obviously be a reason for using VR or 360 video. Quite a lot of the time people use it because they can or to experiment, which is fair enough, but certainly we're at a stage now where this form is mature enough that people are using it for a particular reason. And there are a number of reasons why people might use 360 or VR. The most obvious is that the setting itself is the focus of the story. In some ways it's the main character of the story. Nature-based documentaries, for example, increasingly use VR because the setting, or wildlife documentaries, is part of that, a really key part of that story, and it's a part that doesn't just exist within a normal frame, it's something that you can be immersed in. Equally, you might use VR because you have a setting which is unfilmable, like the brain in the previous example, or you have VR films which are set in space or on other planets. It might be that the environment doesn't exist at all, it's been completely artificially created, or indeed it's purely conceptual. It's a sort of an example of what might exist if something happened. For example, you might create a VR of a future apocalypse or something like that. Another reason for using VR is multiple things happening at the same time in the same environment but beyond the normal frame. This is a reason why it's often used for for big events where lots of things are happening in different directions, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. Another reason would be the experience of a particular spectacle. The Blick YouTube channel has lots of examples of this, and again I'll show you one of these examples as well. And finally, there's the desire to create empathy, the intention being that you are placing the viewer in the shoes of someone, in their environment, in their world, and the intention is for you to help them to feel what it's like to live and experience what those people live and experience in a very different way to reading or watching the same story. So there are lots of examples of those different types in the slides here. In this first example, this is an example of where the setting is the character. So this is again a nature story, nature documentary, and I'll just play through it a little bit so you can look at how it's constructed as well. So first of all, obviously, we're underwater. We can see the diver here holding the 360-degree camera, and if I play this through,
I'm underwater cinematographer Joe Romero. My team and I are taking on a one-of-a-kind mission that could lead to a better understanding of the social dynamics of the fastest shark in the ocean, the mako shark.
Hey Keith, how's she acting, buddy?
so that's that particular example. Then we've got the spectacle example. So this is electric motocross.
I like to ride my dirt bike. It's a passion, it's a sport. I'm professional and I practice the most that I can to not take too much risk. But of course, zero risk, it's not possible. Hey, what's up? It's Matt Robo. I'm 36 years old. I'm from Switzerland, from Estavayer-le-Lac, and I'm riding motocross since I'm 4 years old. And right now, I'm the first European rider who.
You might be feeling a little bit dizzy by that point, so that's a bit of spectacle. Behind the scenes, this is an example. There's a couple of examples here of 360, which is based around events where lots of things are happening in different directions. This is behind the scenes at a music video.
So right now we are at Mukesh Mills and we are shooting our new music video called How We Do It, featuring Badsha and Pepsi. And this location is so so amazing. Like, let's see, Annie, and buildings and boats everywhere. So it's pretty cool. So let's go.
I gotta reach for the life that I'm living for. I gotta look to the sky when it's gonna pour. And no fear for the fight when you're about to score. And that's a matter of fact, and that's a matter of fact. Cause when you see me, you see me, you see me ballin'. Body to body, I hear 'em calling. Yo, we going up and we never falling. Let's go, let's go.
So right now we are at Mukesh.
And here's another one behind the scenes. This is during the 2016 election at Times Square. So here we can see the stage, if you like, the set where they're broadcasting from, but we can also see the wider environment of Times Square and what's going on. A very high position and very passive. There's very little extra production here in terms of sound or narration or anything else. You can also have purely, if you like, made up virtual spaces. In this particular video, this is a presentation by a woman who worked on a virtual reality visualization, data visualization of the stock market, and I'll just play through the section where she talks about that.
In IMAX. So, you start pre-2000 boom. You can see sort of elements going by on the left-hand side, like a timeline. And the path that you're walking on is mapped to the inverse of the price-to-earnings ratio. So as you are approaching the top, that path is getting really, really skinny. And you can look down and see, man, that is a skinny path. That is dangerous. And that happened really fast. This is really steep. And we're about to go down. And here we go. Oh no. Oh no. I've never had to narrate this in real time before. Utilized a sort of color understanding as well.
So here we're talking about data visualization, about essentially telling stories with numbers, but telling it in a 3D space that people can explore. There's a lot of weaknesses to this. It can be potentially misleading or distorting. This is another video, a very short video representing the results of some research that basically says that VR doesn't add anything necessarily to the visualization, but it's another example of how often 360 or virtual, I should say VR, data visualization allows people to walk around the objects in 3D.
Workload insight-based comparisons between VR and traditional visualization tools. We find that there is no overall task workload difference between mediums, but there are differences in the accuracy and depth of insights that users gain. Our results also suggest that workload insight-based comparisons.
And if you want to find out more about data visualization in VR, there's a whole panel discussion embedded in the slides as well.
Let's see.
So a few things to think about in terms of creating VR and 360 experiences. The first is where you are positioning the user in that story. One position is as a participant. They might be spoken to directly in the VR story. So essentially they take on the role of a character within the story. Other characters might speak to the camera, speak to the person in a number of roles. They might be treated as another character in the story or as a member of the audience, if you like. Alternatively, they might be positioned as an observer, invisible and not involved in the action that's taking place, that's unfolding within the virtual reality of the story. Equally, it's worth thinking about to what extent the pace and outcome of the story is controlled by the user, or if there's no control. One of the things that's worth drawing attention to in some of the examples that I played there is the use of editing to change the pace of the story, to cut from one scene to another. And there's also this concept of avatar anthropomorphism. In other words, the degree to which the viewer identifies with the avatar or the people in the virtual reality story. Another key concept is the idea of immersion itself. This relates to things like the degree to which the viewer is isolated in their physical environment. For example, it's a very different experience of a virtual reality story if someone is watching on a mobile phone without any headphones, or they're wearing goggles, virtual reality goggles, and Oculus Rift type goggles with headphones in a dark room with no other distractions. Likewise, there's the perception of how much they're included in the virtual environment. So I've mentioned the degree to which they might be positioned as a character in the story. To what extent their interactions with that environment might be natural. So if they move forward, does the camera move forward as well? How much can they control where the camera is pointing? Do they move within the environment, or are they moved without any control? A lot of this is reliant on the type of VR that's involved. Really, we're talking about two forms here: high-tech VR, like the Oculus Rift or PS4 based virtual reality with a lot of processing power and high-end hardware in terms of the headsets that are used, and low-tech VR, which might be based on a mobile phone or technology, low-cost technology like Google Cardboard. And as I said, both of these have implications for immersion and what's called proprioception. That's your awareness of your different body parts and how they behave in the virtual environment. Part of this is a term that's called RAIR, or response as if real. This is the degree to which someone involved in a VR story responds as if the actions in that story are real. And in this particular piece of research, it's related to these concepts of place illusion and plausibility illusion. So to what degree you believe you're in the place, and to what degree the events in that place are plausible. So, for example, a strong response as if real might be that you physically step back as someone approaches the camera in virtual reality. A weak response would be that you don't do that, you merely observe and you know that that person is going to just kind of walk through the space that you occupy, that you're not really there. And then we have the concept of presence. And there are a number of factors that influence this idea of presence. Again, a lot of this revolves around interaction and how easily the audience, the user, can interact with the virtual environment, to move across it, for example, to what extent other elements in that environment react to them. So, can you move objects? Can you change the environment that you're in? How realistic is the video, the image that you're sitting in? How long does it last? The longer it lasts, perhaps you might become more immersed, more present in that VR experience, and so on. So again, if you're considering some sort of VR or 360 storytelling, it's worth considering some of these factors and how they influenced the level of presence that someone might experience. To show you another example, this is a piece of VR filmed by BBC News outside the Bataclan. You might remember there was an attack, a tragic event at the Bataclan. And this is another good example of VR being used, or 360 video being used, because the scene itself involves lots of things happening, lots of different things happening in the same space. So you can turn your attention in different directions and still see something happening.
So this is the scene outside the Bataclan. They've opened up the street now. There are a lot of people with tears in their eyes. They're bringing flowers. It just feels so somber here, very, very somber indeed.
So a couple of things to draw attention to here. First of all, as I said, there's lots of things happening in lots of different directions. So in that sense, it's well suited to 360-degree video. Different people might want to point their attention in different parts of this story, if you like. And it's a factual story, obviously. These are real events. Part of that story is the fact that the camera is actually positioned quite high up, which is quite common, partly because you get a better view of what's happening, but also you might say that this affects the level of presence that you have in this story, because you're not at the level you would normally be, so there's less of a sense of you occupying a body. And of course we can see the person holding the stick with the 360-degree camera on it, and he's narrating this video as well, so we've got the editorial decision to have narration. The tone of that narration very much suits the kind of genre of a report on a tragic event. It's a very somber narration, but it's delivered after the fact. We can see his lips aren't moving, so it's been recorded afterwards, which again takes us out of that space of this particular virtual reality.
You know, the city's moving in the background, and the story following on from Friday's attacks is also moving very, very quickly. But here, things feel somehow frozen.
We've also got the decision to move the camera, so you're being moved by the narrator. You have no agency in that. So again, that affects the experience you have, the immersive experience, and your control over that environment. The narration tells you about his feeling of what the scene feels like. So this is, again, you're being told what the scene feels like, rather than necessarily being allowed to form those sensations yourself. So in this sense, this is actually quite a traditional, really not very different to a journalistic two-way, where someone might go to a reporter and ask them what's it like, what's the feeling like on the ground, and he might say exactly the same thing, but we would just have a 2D shot rather than a 360-degree shot. This is what's called remediation, which I'll come on to later. And here we are. Remediation is essentially the process of taking one type of media and to some extent transferring the rules of that medium, the conventions of that medium, the techniques of that medium into another one. So what we saw in that last video is taking the report form, the type of report that would normally be done on TV for an event like this, and transferring that into the 360-degree medium. So a new medium, but the same techniques. You might call this shovelware, but it's a little bit more sophisticated than that as a concept. Bolter and Grusin popularised this term remediation, or coined this term, and their book from 1999 is worth reading, of the same name. It's called Remediation. Talks about a whole history of remediation in media, from, for example, Renaissance art, and how art and rules of composition have found their way into new media like photography, which has then moved into film and cinema and so on. And as those forms develop, they develop their own languages in addition to the conventions that they inherit or borrow from older forms. And we've seen a lot of that in virtual reality. So a lot of the examples that I've shown you already include things like cuts, include narration, which are essentially taken from documentary. They're very similar to documentary in form, but again, we've got this different type of shot, the 360-degree shot. Why, for example, do we hide the camera operator? In that last example we didn't, but in a lot of VR documentaries we don't see the camera operator. There's an attempt to mask the production of the documentary itself, which again comes from documentary. We wouldn't normally show the people involved. You could also argue that virtual reality is a remediation of theatre. For example, in theatre, we have to design a set. We pay a bit more attention to the setting as a key character in the story, and we know that the audience can look at any place on that set. They can look anywhere they want. So first of all, we need to make sure that the whole stage, the whole set, can maintain that focus, that people can look in different directions and get some sort of visual information. But equally, we use techniques to draw attention to different parts of the stage. Lighting, for example, sound are two key examples, the use of colour, the way that items are arranged. And again, it might be that some of these techniques find their way more into virtual reality as the medium develops. And of course, like theatre, virtual reality is not just a story but an experience often. If you think of the examples like Blisk's videos of jet flights and bikes somersaulting, these are you experiencing what it's like to be in the seat of a jet plane or a motocross bike. You can even go back to the 19th century and the panoramas that were created by a guy called Robert Barker. These were canvases essentially that went all around the viewer, the person looking at them, so that they could have this panoramic, this 360-degree experience. But what's particularly interesting about Barker's panoramas was that he didn't just create these canvases that went all the way around the person that was looking at them, but also the experience was tightly controlled. They entered the panorama from below and they were positioned at a particular height in the middle of that canvas. Lighting was tightly controlled, the edges of the canvas as well, so that essentially they were moved into the middle. In fact, as the piece of research that's linked in the last slide says, Barker wasn't taking the picture out of a frame, he was making the frame big enough to include the spectator as well. And there's some interesting precursors to VR that we can learn from in terms of these sorts of immersive experiences. A lot of this is about the editorial choices that are made by the creator, and some of these involve audio. Audio can have quite an important role in a VR experience. For example, there's a decision to be made whether there is narration or if the person is addressed directly by people in the video, or if there's no narration or speech at all. Even within a narration, you can choose to have the narrator describe what's being seen, to direct attention to certain elements on the screen, or to provide complementary information. For example, it might be an interview that's being played over the 360-degree video or virtual reality that you're seeing. So you're seeing the environment that someone lives in, but hearing an interview with the person who lives in that environment. They're not talking about the environment, but you're getting some context to what they're talking about. And again, I'll show you another example just to illustrate some of these editorial decisions. As you watch this, think about what decisions have been made in the production of this piece of video.
On a rooftop above Fallujah, an Iraqi sniper takes careful aim at an ISIS soldier. He slowly tracks his target. And then this is Fallujah, Iraq. Nearly 300,000 civilians used to live here. Now it's a ghost town. Some of the most iconic fighting in the American War happened here in 2000.
Okay, so again, just have a think about some of the editorial choices that were made there. First of all, we've got a cut, so we've cut from one scene to another. In fact, there was another cut as well, a kind of a fade, a crossfade earlier in the previous shot. We've got the decision to have narration, we've got the decision to have a title screen, and that title screen is a good example of what happens with titles and text in virtual reality, how you draw attention to that. We've also got the choice of the opening shot. So I think the opening shot in this particular sequence is quite a nicely composed shot, even if you didn't move from it. We've got some nice angles, rule of thirds taking place of it. The kind of frame of the default view is still carefully considered. We've also got the decision not to include the details of the camera itself. So you can see a little bit here of where it was, but that's been removed. There's no reporter, there's no narrator, they're just invisible. We've also got the decision to move the audience. So again, they don't have any agency. The viewer doesn't have any decision or control over the fact that they're moving through this particular landscape. So while they're static, the camera is moving. In addition to the audio, the speech audio, the narration that we just heard, and other options like being spoken to on camera, we've also got non-speech audio. For example, music. For the start of that clip, there was some music, some quite foreboding music to set a certain tone of expectation of what's going to follow. There's the use of wild track, sound that's captured on location, the sound of people speaking or the sound of gunfire, things like that. And we also have audio cues. When you're watching a 360-degree video, you can direct your attention in any area, in any direction. So audio can be quite important in directing the viewer to turn their attention to a particular point on the screen. Let's look at another example to explore that. And again, we've got the editorial choice here to position the camera quite far away from the subject. The frame is composed in a particular way. There's a really strong sense of composition in this shot, even though you can move around anywhere you want. And in fact, you might argue that because this shot is so well composed, you might be less inclined to actually use the 360-degree options. Here we have a weird situation where we have the shadow of the 360-degree camera, but we can't actually see the thing that's causing the shadow. And this is quite a common technique where the caption is repeated in different places on the screen so that it still gets read even if you're not looking at the primary focus of the shot. So we've got this in 3 different parts. So wherever you are, you're going to see a little bit of that text, assuming you're not looking up here or down here, and get that information.
прошлом году в мое село пришла война.
And finally, we have some narration, some speech, which is essentially an interview with the person. And again, we're getting information that's complementary to what we're seeing on screen. What we're actually hearing is a story of what happened before the particular scenario that we're seeing in front of us. But the scenario in front of us complements that with the current situation. There's also lots of other techniques here. We've got music, obviously, a sort of an ambient soundtrack. We've got the wild track of the sounds of movement. We've got other devices as well. We've got, again, some really well composed shots, which perhaps might make you less inclined to pan around. We've got text on screen. We've got the structure of a story with titles and credits. We've got subtitles, captions, and so on. Now, with audio, you can also start to think about audio in the sense of 360 degrees. It's not just the camera that's a 360 degree camera. Your microphone might be a 360 degree camera, or ambisonic microphone. Sorry, your microphone might be 360 degrees or ambisonic as well. Or you might use what's called binaural audio. You'll see a couple of links at the bottom there that can tell you more about these and some of the practicalities. But this is what binaural sound means. It basically means two microphones positioned about 7 inches apart. In other words, in the positions that human ears would be, either side of the head. And this means that you are essentially recreating the human experience in terms of the way that sound travels, because obviously a piece of sound in a video will reach one ear slightly quicker than the other in terms of which ear is closest. Whereas with a normal microphone, you're only capturing one particular place, and when sound hits that particular place.
Is the time. Okay, now you are listening in binaural sound, which is all about making you feel like you're really there. And it's so much more than just putting certain sounds into one ear and certain sounds into another. Right now, it should really feel like I'm walking closer to you around the left side of your head. It gets better because I can walk behind you and it really sounds like I'm there.
Now, if you are listening to this on headphones, I'm not sure if the effect is recreated in the recording, so it's well worth watching this video, this short video clip yourself in the slides with headphones on, but you'll get that sense where his voice travels, particularly as he walks round the side of these microphones. You hear the sound in your left ear, you feel the sense of him walking around your head in a way that's very different to normal sound, or indeed even to stereo. Stereo is simply the idea of recording different tracks in different headphones. It isn't necessarily the same idea of those sounds corresponding to the way that sound travels to different ears.
Is the time.
360 sound or ambisonic sound, the two are slightly different, and you can click on this link to find out more about the distinction, but fundamentally very similar ideas. Both of these are about recording sound that is not just about two ears, but also relates to the movement of your head. So a microphone that records this sort of sound looks like this. And you can see more in this video about the principles behind this and how it works. But fundamentally, if I skip forward, there's another microphone
Hi, Mika.
like that as well. Fundamentally, we're talking about this sort of movement. So as you move your head up and down while listening to ambisonic sound or 360 sound, the sound is changing based on what that sound is like, depending on a microphone, if you like, being positioned in the space where your head is. Likewise, as you move left to right or as you tilt from side to side, you're going to get slightly different sound experiences. So it's more than simply two tracks, if you like, going into two different sets of headphones. It's about detecting your position and giving you the sound that's relevant to that position. So that's some of the considerations around sound, but equally there are editorial choices around the camera. You might not have a frame as such in the sense that you have a 360-degree frame, but you do have choices about where to place the camera, where to position it. We saw an example where the camera is positioned above head height, probably about 7 or 8 feet high. We've looked at examples where they've chosen a starting position with a very well composed starting frame. Even though the frame is 360 degrees, you start pointing in one direction. We've also seen examples where the camera is moved. This can create motion sickness in viewers because essentially they get the visual information of movement while their body does not get the same information. So that can be quite disorientating or even uncomfortable for viewers. You might choose whether to adopt a point of view angle from the point of view of a particular person in the story. You might choose to introduce cuts or not. Again, we've seen some examples of that. Introducing cuts to some extent breaks that sense of control in the same way as moving the camera does. And you might choose to have captions as well. And again, we've seen examples of that. One behind the scenes description of a VR documentary talks about some of those editorial decisions and the idea of composing a shot in virtual reality. It's quite interesting to read the makers of that documentary talk about having some sort of primary action within a few feet of a camera, but also other things happening around that in the medium or far distance. So they're struggling with, they're kind of tackling this challenge of having enough in the shot, in the 360-degree shot, that can justify the use of VR, and also essentially composing a near distance, middle distance and far distance image. Another example to mention here is the VR film Catatonic, which is a piece of fiction, and one of the ways that they deal with this issue around the control that the user has is to put the viewer in a wheelchair. So the story involves, first of all, you're in the point of view of a person in this VR story, but also that person is in a wheelchair. So it means that you don't have to move your legs, and that solves to some extent some of the challenges of control of the user. You can use your arms, but you can't use your legs. Now, in terms of the tools that you might use to create some of this, there are some very simple tools just to get started with some of the basic concepts. Google Street View, for example, the app, the mobile phone app, allows you to take 360-degree images of any place that you are and upload them to Google Street View itself. Fuse allows you to create 360-degree images. You can watch VR on your phone using apps like Discovery VR or Within or Jaunt VR or NYT VR. All of these provide virtual reality experiences, and probably the main thing to do to begin with is just watch lots of these and get a feel for how the medium works, its conventions, and also how it's developed and changed and experimented. In terms of filming, there are lots of different VR cameras or 360-degree cameras. The one that we have at BCU is the Kodak Pix Pro, so you can actually book those out. One distinction to make as well, to be aware of when it comes to 360-degree cameras, is the way that those cameras film. So you have dual lens cameras where you've got two different sets of footage that are stitched together, and you've got single lens films where there is no stitching. It's all one piece of footage, if you like. And then there are some other pieces of advice to be aware of. Dougal Shaw often uses 360-degree cameras in his work for the BBC. You can see here him giving the tip about the removal of the stick by the software and the fact that that then leaves you with a clenched fist. So you have to think about what you do with that fist in the filming. So how are you going to position your arm? And we saw, again, some examples of that in the videos that we watched. This Twitter thread is well worth exploring to watch some video of Dougal talking about how he made one story using a 360 camera as well as an iPhone and a gimbal. Let's then move on to end with augmented reality. We've talked about virtual reality and 360 video, but it's also worth talking about augmented reality, which shares a lot of very similar concepts, but also has a lot of differences. First of all, the practicalities of AR revolve around sensors or some sort of way of orienting the augmentation that's going to be placed on screen. The most common way that AR is done is that the two sensors on your phone, the GPS, which is where you are physically, and the gyroscope, which way you're facing, provide information to allow the AR story or the app to overlay information on the screen. So it tells the software which way the camera is facing and then adds extra details on top of the screen. We'll see a few examples in a minute. Another way of orienting is a QR code. When the camera picks up that QR code on the phone, it understands which way a surface is oriented, and then it allows it to augment that surface in particular ways. And then a third way that AR is orientated is through object recognition. So Snapchat filters are a classic example of this. When you use a filter on Snapchat, it looks for a face, it recognizes a face, and then it augments that face with various effects that you've chosen. So I'll show you a few examples. This is an example of something which is using the sensors on a phone to overlay, to augment what the camera is seeing with some extra material, some old photos. In this example, this is essentially like a QR code where part of a surface is recognized and then other information is overlaid.
Save it to your device.
Is overlaid on that surface.
To start, tap Take Photo in the upper right menu. This opens a camera button at the bottom of the screen. Tap it to capture the interactive experience that you're viewing. Tap Use if you're happy with the photo that you've taken. Then you can share your experience with friends, colleagues, and followers. Or you can save it to your phone or tablet and use it however you want. Download the Layer app.
So this is often used in magazines that might have some sort of QR code, and then when someone points their phone at a page with a QR code, it will overlay some video or some other extra content onto that page. Here's another example of a project that took election posters and created an augmented reality experience that would provide extra information about those posters. So to wrap up there, we've looked at a number of different forms of immersive media. The key thing when using any of these is to have a clear reason for doing that. What is it about your story that suits the medium? Is it that the setting is a really strong focal character itself? Is it that lots of different things are going on in that environment? Is it a particular environment that you could not film? It has to be virtually recreated, or it's one that is conceptual or abstract. When you create some sort of immersive experience, consider some of the editorial decisions that we've covered, such as whether you're going to have narration, what sort of narration you're going to have, where you're going to position the viewer, in other words the camera, whether you're going to edit it in some way, use cuts, use movement, and what role sound is going to play more generally. Also consider some of the elements of immersion and presence and the factors involved in that and how that relates to your story, as well as related concepts like proprioception. Remember, you can learn a lot from remediation as well. What can you learn from theatre design? What can you learn from documentary making that might be applied to your particular story? In terms of further reading, you'll find a BBC Storytelling and Audience Insights report on VR on Moodle, or you can pick any of the research from those two links. The first one is anything that I've bookmarked on research about VR, and the second is anything that I've bookmarked about research on VR.